Now, when I read parts of your biography, Daughter of the East, I read the first chapter, which so poignantly talked about your father's assassination. And one of the things that you talked about was how your father worried about you not being a politician yet. My question is, when did you feel that you became a politician? Is there an event or a set of events that jogged you and just made you feel that, this is it, I am now a politician?
It's a difficult question to answer because, in a sense, I had never wanted to come into politics. And there isn't a single event which I can point to and say that when this event occurred, I became a politician. In many ways, rather foolishly, I still think I'm not a politician. I remember I came into politics by force of circumstances when my father's government was overthrown. Our senior leaders were imprisoned, expecting to go back to ordinary life when my father was released. When that did not happen, I assisted my mother, who was then the chairperson of the party, and again expected to go back as soon as she was elected to a proper career or a life of my own. She fell ill and was unable to lead the party, and I was forced to step in as the acting chairperson and then the co-chairperson of the party and to lead it with her. I expected, after my first election, that democracy would be restored and we'd free the political prisoners, free the press, free the trade unions. And I say it because these were our paramount concerns, the political prisoners who had been sentenced for life and they had no avenue of appeal by military courts. And also, as I mentioned, the press was censored and the trade unions were our big support. And I thought, well, I'm going to fight these elections and do these things and then I'm going to go back. And then our government got sacked. So somehow or the other, the last election in 1993, my brother contested against me. So I thought, well, I've got to do this. And he can't win, and nobody else in my party can do it, so I've got to do it this time. And after this term, when I have a president of my own, and I'll complete the term. So it's just been like years and years and years have passed with me actually now being very actively in the political field, but not reconciling myself to being a politician as such.
A question I had has to do with your background and how you can come across to the ordinary people of Pakistan. That your family is quite non-traditional, and all the emphases of it are different, or many of them are different from that of a typical Pakistani family. And I'm wondering, as you campaign, how do you cross that barrier or make that transition between the very non-traditional background that you have in order to appeal to people, the majority, who still have traditional values and views? How do you, as a politician, as a campaigner, how do you do that?
Well, first of all, in traditional societies, there is an expectancy that the privileged classes don't act according to tradition. It's a strange thing to say, and maybe it doesn't look very nice to say it, but there's an expectancy that they're different. They speak English, they go abroad for their education, they live in big homes, they drive cars, people listen to them. So it's very cut off from the lives of ordinary people, but there's an acceptance that this is the way, that their norms are not our norms.
I see.
One. The second aspect is the familiarity, which means that they are us. So it's a kind of a contradiction. But within that contradiction is that they're different, or we are different, and we are of them. To be of them is that you can relate to them, you know them. I can walk into the homes of poor people in my country, and I get accepted as a member of the family. So I'm one of them, even though I may live my life a little differently. I'm one of them. Because I walk into their homes, I can see the problems they have. I visit them in villages, and we all sit around under a tree. They'll put a bed, and we'll all sit and chat. And they'll tell me, well, the problem with our village is we don't have electricity. Can you help us get electricity? Or I'll go to a slum, And people there will say, well, our problem is we don't have drinking water. Can you help us with drinking water? So they feel that I'm accessible,
I see.
that I can walk into their homes and they know me. And they feel they know me for a variety of reasons. One, I have traveled extensively. Secondly, we have a very vast party organization. So our local party leader will be there, and there'll be somebody known as the People's Party man. So it's like we have their ambassador or our ambassador with them. The third aspect is also traditional, because my grandfather was in politics. And all the important families in those days, there were very few important families, and they all knew them. And he had a very important position, and so he was able to oblige many people. And so there was a huge networking because of my grandfather. Then my father himself knew people practically in every village who had worked with him. So in that sense, I was familiar because I was my father's daughter. And then the Bhuttos are the largest tribe in southern Punjab and Sindh. And in undivided, in pre-partition or once upon a time, Sindh was all the way up to Multan. So it's historical reasons, it's traditional reasons, it's political, popular reasons, but there's this vast network which for 3 generations has known each other and feels familiarity. Familiarity in terms of approach, because government is vast, government is distant, people don't know who to go to, but with the People's Party, they feel we'll get into government.
Is there a converse expectation on their part of you then? Expectation that you will do something for them, oblige them?
Of course there is, that they will get obliged. Not obliged in terms of corruption or nepotism, no. But they will be obliged in the sense that if they need a school or a hospital or electricity, their voice will be heard. Otherwise, it's bureaucracy. So in England or America, you have the congressman. You go to your congressman. He's your lobbyist. You want an answer from, somebody wants an answer from the Americans, what's your foreign policy, they'll give them. If they want an answer that what are you doing in my particular area for a highway or a bridge or a football team or a football stadium, they'll get an answer. So here there is a different style. But public representatives are basically lobbyists. They're people to whom you go to for problems. And in the case of the Pakistan People's Party, not in the negative sense, but in the very positive sense, that if we could increase literacy rates by 1/3, it was because it wasn't done through bureaucracy. It was done through all these people who wanted to share in the endeavor. If we were able to subdue terrorism in Karachi, it wasn't due to bureaucracy. It was because people who were were in the PPP and had relatives in the MQM wanted peace. And they came and gave us information that this man is going to be doing this killing on such and such day, or there'll be a bomb planted on such and such day. So we had the vast reservoir of the people to help and to assist us. But yes, there is an expectancy that if the People's Party is elected, the jobs will be saved. There is an expectancy that if the People's Party is elected, our village or our ward will get something from government. Not we as an individual, but we as a community will benefit from a PPP government. Now, others have tried to do it. Let's see, Mr. Junaid, Mr. Nawaz Sharif, all have tried to do it. They've all tried to create local warlords who would dispense favor and patronage. But the difference between them and the People's Party is that they get individuals, and then the individuals tend to look after themselves or tend to have a more restricted system by which they dispense the favor. Whereas in the People's Party, because it's got popular support, these decisions are taken more at the community level. They're taken by the local wards, they're taken by the local villages. So it's not an individual who's been appointed, it's the group.
My question here, if I would interject, would be very relevant to the discussion that's been going on, and yet I think it'll take it a little in a direction that's a little different. What I'm interested in is the evolution of your political consciousness. And I think Mr. Johnson mentioned the idea of when you become a politician, and Professor Campbell was also interested in knowing exactly what kind of a relationship you have with the people of Pakistan. But when you were responding to them, you came from two different angles. In the sense, you're talking about your awareness in terms of what politics means at the level of actually practicing it amongst people who have power and at the international level. On the other hand, there are the people of Pakistan who are the reservoir for this very power source that representatives have. In this book of yours and otherwise also, there are plenty of instances where from a very early age you were exposed to situations. As a very young girl, you traveled to China with your father. You were at Shimla, a historical moment when the Shimla Pact was made. Would you like to talk a little bit about that and tell us how it was that your interest in politics was furthered or perhaps ignited by these events, and how they helped shape the way you think, the way you talk today?
Well, I had an exposure to political life because I came from a political family. My father did politics, he founded the People's Party. We met important people all the time. And there were political discussions in our home which we listened to, particularly the movement against Ayub Khan, the first military dictator which my father launched. It had a radicalization effect on all of us. I was born in 1953, a few years after the Chinese Revolution took place. And in those days, people believed in revolution. And we grew up, we are very different now. But we all grew up believing in revolution. And we all grew up believing in socialism. Not necessarily communism, but Scandinavian type of socialism. So it was a different time and a different era. And my father somehow, I had an impression, wanted me to go into politics. And that was always there, but it was like I was frightened of politics. I didn't want to do it. And I was frightened of it because first to take my father away. I remember as a young child that he was always had to go. He was always traveling. And so I didn't like politics because of that. And then later on when he fought Ayub, the assassination attempt started. I remember even at Lahore airport when his shirt came back and I heard my mother say there's blood on it. Fear in my heart. So there was always a fear about politics. And I found thought of going into politics repugnant, even though I spent a lifetime now in it. And eventually when my father died, he set me free. Just before he died. He said, if you want to go, you can leave. You can go to England or Switzerland. And I've taken care of you all. You all can, you don't have to do this life. You can get on with your own life. And I said no. So if there was a moment that came when I took a free choice to stay on, it was at that particular moment when I said no, we can't succeed by killing you. We'll continue what you did. And I remember he didn't say anything. He looked satisfied with that. And that's when I took the decision that even if I didn't like it, this was something that I had to do. And then I found that I was caught up in what I had to do, because the more I traveled and the more I saw people, the more I saw the expectation of the People's Party. I saw abject poverty and people who never had clothes, people who went hungry, and I realized how much was expected of the People's Party, and that would be wrong for the People's Party and myself to turn our backs on making a difference when there was a difference we could make. And then as I went along, the time came when I began to shift from what had been our policies of the past. I had always learned from my father that serving the people can take different routes. And for those of us who continue with the anti-American slogans, I found it strange at the time when Margaret Thatcher was saying that she's going to do business with Gorbachev. So I thought if the Americans and the Russians are going to be Soviets are going to be doing business with each other, the world is changing. What are we doing fighting for anti-Americanism or anti-imperialism when the two of them on top are making up? And this was a very critical period because it marked the departure of the People's Party as an anti-American party and to more moderate mainstream politics. And it was much misunderstood. Subsequently in 88, that happened I think around 1984-85. In 88, our program of privatization was also misunderstood. But the times had changed. All the countries, the public sector were moving slowly European countries are moving slowly towards privatization or deregulation. So I evolved into contemporary thinking, influenced by contemporary debate and contemporary events. But there were those who remained part of the past. And I also felt that it was important to change with the times because people changed. New people were born, new people came into positions of power. I remember when I was at Harvard, the students, my generation, we didn't care about exams, we didn't care about grades. We wanted to be good people. We wanted to take time off, we wanted to be good citizens, we wanted to do environment. And then later on it changed. By the time my sister went there, 4 or 5 years later, they were all yuppies who wanted to make money. So it was, things changed. And I realized I was with my father when he made one of the most important speeches which influenced my life. And he said at the time of 1971, when we were all scared the country would break up and where would Pakistan be? And he said that, realities change. The reality was the German troops were at the gates of Stalingrad, and reality is changed. And so for me, I feel it's important to keep up with changing realities.
I have a question which if I may follow up on this with something that you said regarding the economic situation, regarding socialism, which your father talked about. He talked about this idea of Islamic socialism. And then realities change, and of course there is this idea of a new global order. There's also this idea of privatization. Do you and your party believe in capitalism as it is practiced in the West, or do you have a different sense of the economic realities in terms of and conditionalities in terms of Pakistan and other sort of countries?
To be honest, most of us have socialist yearnings still. And we feel that capitalism is very ruthless. And that in Pakistan, if it was just left to the capitalists, the poor people would be really, really exploited. And we think that it's important for the government, for the state to step in as the protector of the weak and the disadvantaged. We can't do it as often as we would like because we understand that the rules of the games have changed. Wherever and whenever we can, we do. For instance, every time there used to be a raise in electricity rates, we used to say, okay, it will be raised 0 or 2% for the lowest rate. And then we'd go up to the highest rate for the upper echelons, which was not done by Junejo and it was not done by Mr. Nawaz Sharif, but it was done by us. So wherever we could step in the terms of taxes, in the terms of utilities, in the terms of resource distribution, we always wanted to step in on the side of the underprivileged and the disadvantaged. We also believed, for instance, in the rice corporation and the cotton corporation, because we found that otherwise the middlemen refused to buy, force the prices down, and then buy at a pittance, and then sell in the international market at huge prices. And we thought that small farmers are disadvantaged, and that rural poverty can be alleviated if the government steps in to stabilize prices. And that's not acceptable by capitalist standards. But we did, wherever we could, do what we could to protect the disadvantaged. We were under a lot of pressure to retrench workers, and we were told the steel mill is overstaffed and the banks are overstaffed. But we refused to do it because we said so long as we're improving our performance, why should we retrench them? For instance, in the steel mill was down to its last boiler when we took over, and they hadn't paid any of their lengths. So the first we had 2 chairmen. They got the second boiler running, and they didn't make a profit, but they made enough to pay back their installment, not the installment of the past, but their installment. So we said, well, it's picking up. So why should we retrench 6,000 workers of the steel mill if the steel mill's performance is picking up? Now the corporations are all doing badly, but in our time, PSO was making a profit of ₹1 billion. So we said, well, if it's making a profit of ₹1 billion, we can have a budget of 4 crores, which is a small amount, for new jobs. So, we were always trying to help people who are under privileged in whatever we did. Even in the universities, there was a lot of pressure that it isn't money. So we said, all right, we'll make 2 systems. A system where 25% we pay and get in, but 75% has to be for those who can't pay. So I think it's I'm not sure capitalism is the best system, but it's better than anything else that we see, because certainly state control doesn't work. State control leads to state capitalism. So then it suffers from the same weaknesses. And I think it's very important to have initiative. I have seen initiative destroyed. I have seen, even though I think socialism is important, or its principles are important for human equality and dignity, and helping the weak and the disadvantaged, I have seen people who lose ambition, lose inertia, don't bother to work, don't lift a finger, because they think that they're there, and whether they work or they don't work. So I've seen the stifling of human initiative through socialism, and there must be a happy mix that can be found. And what it is, I don't know yet.
So what? Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow on that, Ms. Bhutto. So what kinds of things do you think the government could do to encourage initiative, to provide incentives? What kinds of things?
Economic incentives?
Yeah.
But I think economics, you have to free it up as much as possible and deregulate. That's what we did. We intervened on the side of the powerless. And as far as the powerful were concerned, we thought that we shouldn't have government regulations, and we did that in concrete terms. For instance, when I became Prime Minister of Pakistan, the banks of Pakistan could not give a loan beyond 5 lakhs. How much would 5 lakhs be at 20 rupees a dollar? And it used to be 20 rupees to the dollar, and it was
$2 million?
no, it couldn't. No, it's not 2 million. It's not 2 million.
$25,000.
I don't know how much, whatever it was 20 rupees to the dollar, and the total amount that a bank manager could give was 5 lakhs. Every other bank loan had to be sanctioned by the Ministry of Finance. So Ministry of Finance created a coterie of favored businessmen who could invest, and then there were the disfavored who had no opportunities, and we changed that. We said henceforth the Ministry of Finance will have nothing to do. We deregulated the banking system, and we set up committees in the banks, 50% government, 50% private sector, from the elected bodies like the APTMA and so on. And we said, you will decide all the loans yourself. So this opened up the ability of people to get loans. And it did away with the corruption of the past. Now we hear about the people who defaulted on loans. But the defaults came when the Ministry of Finance was giving it. Now when there are these groups, you can't get over invoiced loans. Even if you try to get it, it will be a small number. It won't be the large number, because it's a broad-based and open, transparent decision-making where all the members know about it. All the members can complain, they can go to the press, they can go to the court, they can go to the parliament. So that was one of the things we did. Secondly, we made the State Bank of Pakistan autonomous. We did away with a whole host of permissions that were needed for import and export. We opened up export so that people could do it freely without government interference. So we unleashed the entrepreneurial power of the people at large, and we changed a monopoly capitalistic system into a more even playing field. Of course, those who could lobby better or had better connection would get ahead. But as far as the state was concerned, we withdrew.
I had a question, a two-part question about the PPP. A lot of the first part of my question has been answered, I think, about its objectives and such platform. Let me go to the second one, and that is that I've read that one deficiency of the PPP is institutionalized structure, that it depends too much on personalities, and that there's not an ongoing philosophy or strategy that can survive individuals. Would you comment on that, about the institutionalization of the program and the strategy?
Well, it's true to some extent, and it's not true to some extent. Because in the sense the People's Party has certain policies that continue irrespective of who's in power. And that is, it's the core program of liberalism, of modernity, of technology, of distance from religious bigotry, of women's rights and minority rights, protection of labor, free press. So I think there is a very strong core People's Party program which is free of whoever is in power. It's anti-military rule. It's never supported military dictatorship. It believes in a pluralistic society. So there is a core People's Party program. But there isn't institutionalization because it hasn't had a chance for institutionalization. It's either in power or, and when you're in power, you can't really institutionalize. And at least in Pakistan, because governments are under siege from the military, from the intelligence, and from other quarters, from political opponents. And in opposition, it doesn't have the time to institutionalize either, because all the time its leaders are being tried, it's having demonstrations and protests, its people are being arrested. So in that sort of sense, we suffer from institutional decision making, and we're not the only ones. Other political parties also suffer because there isn't yet enough of democracy where there's tolerance for other parties to develop. Now, I should be in Pakistan institutionalizing my party. I can't be because I'm being persecuted. So in this system, it's very difficult to institutionalize it. Secondly, the problem that we face is fundraising, because people aren't prepared to give to the party. They're only prepared to give to individuals they know. I don't collect funds, and I just don't collect funds. But localized parties, they do. Now, our Central Executive Committee is supposed to pay a minimum amount for minimum telephones. They don't, and often I find that I and my friends have to pick up the tab. So you can't get institutionalization until people are willing to pay their dues. But the most senior members of the party are not willing to pay, and the richest, the ones who aren't well-to-do, they pay. So unless you have permanent staff, how can you have institutional working when everything is done on volunteerism? The third thing is that there isn't a kind of institution, because in the party, while there are many people who want to be leaders, they think the path to leadership is by courting the diplomatic community or the military community. So I find that people who will be my rivals for power, or who will want to start a debate within the party hierarchy, will not be people who will go to our people. They'll be people who go and join the diplomatic parties and say, I'm going to be a better leader. And they'll go to the military and say, I'm going to be a better leader, but they have no support. Unless they put in the effort of traveling as much as I do, unless they put in the effort of putting their money in it. Politics costs money. My father hadn't given me independent means, I won't have been able to do politics. And it takes energy, it takes your time. It means you can't do the things you might like to do, like go on holidays to Italy with your children. And somehow or the other, I've seen that throughout my life, 25, 23 years, there have been people who wanted my job. But I have not seen them work together. I've seen them lobby the military and the diplomatic community. So in that sort of sense, there isn't even a debate, because the people who do this have no locus standi within the party as such. Recently, we had the fallout of a leader of ours from Frontier. He was a man that the party had elected as chief minister of the province, and he was held in high regard from people outside. But inside the province, he was a dictator. And he was mistreating all the party people, treating them with contempt. And at the time of the elections in 1997, he couldn't even find candidates from the party to contest because they'd had enough of him. And they didn't want to contest. And there were 40 National Assembly seats, and he could only find candidates for 8 or 10. So I was so shocked that after the elections were over, and we got together the colleagues and decided to reorganize. When his position was taken away with him because the rest of the party people did not want him, people outside Frontier thought that he's a great hero who's fallen out with me, and they took his side. But nobody went for him because he hadn't kept in touch with the people. He'd lost his own base. Farooq Lagari, when he took me on thinking he's got the chair and the power of the President's House, and that the People's Party members will want to stay in power. So they'll all rally around him to stay in power. And he thought that now he's got the mullahs with him because his wife was a bit of a, she used to have all these religious sermons read in her home, and he started going to religious sermons like this Tablighi Jamaat in Lahore and at Raiwind, and he started doing things. So he thought he's going to become their master. He didn't do something to become the master of the public or the poor or the People's Party worker. So in that sort of sense, you can get some, it's like there isn't really an alternative debate, because there isn't anybody who's prepared to put in the effort. not the effort in real terms to make a difference at the popular level. I'd like to see that happen, but till it happens.
Ms. Bhutto, talking about the mullahs, Professor Khwaja asked you a question about your political evolution, and I imagine that one of the most complex facets of your political evolution is dealing with the Islamic authorities and negotiating the various cultures while keeping Islam a central factor in Pakistan, because no one denies that it's a central factor. Some scholars have even said that it is the raison d'etre for Pakistan. My question is, what kinds of things have you done to put out, if you will, the olive branch to the mullahs and other Islamic factors? What kinds of concessions have you had to make? Because I know that you've tried to work with them. Yesterday you addressed some of that in your talk. You talked about how obstructionist they tried to be when you first became prime minister. So what kinds of concessions, and do you see some boundaries that you just couldn't cross, even as you tried to make concessions with them?
We never made concessions with them. We tried to involve them in consultation. We tried to involve them in sending them abroad for Kashmir on areas where they agreed with our government. When we were in opposition under General Zia, there were some mullahs who were against dictatorship, like the Jamaat-e-Ulama-Islam, and that was regarded as a progressive party. So we were with them because they agreed with us on the need for there being an end to dictatorship. In our government, we had a policy on Kashmir which they agreed with. So they were prepared to lobby with it. And we used to also help them with their people-to-people concerns, their developmental schemes, to give them a stake in government. So if there was somebody from like Nawab Zada Nasrullah from Muzaffargarh or Dera Ismail Khan, they'd come and my husband would look after them and meet with them and give them lunch and spend long, long hours just stroking them. But in terms of policy, there wasn't a single issue on which we made a policy to help them or to please them that I can recall. And even the only thing was that we didn't have the support, because we didn't have the parliamentary majority to repeal some of the laws that others had made. People often used to say to us, oh, you're not undoing this. And we used to say, well, we've stopped the decline. Maybe after 5 years we'll be able to reverse the decline. But take satisfaction from the fact that the decline has been stopped. But people wouldn't take satisfaction. The result would be that we'd go and there'd be a further decline, like Nawaz Sharif coming in with this theocratic law. Our party doesn't believe, our first principle of Islam is our faith. We believe religion is our faith. And we feel that as a consequence of our religious faith, we get the policies of democracy and equality. Or we used to say socialism is our economy, democracy is our polity, and all power with the people. So we feel that people who are Muslims ought to promote democracy and equality. But we see Islam as our faith, and we see our mission in government to promote democracy and equality. We don't see it as a means to promote religious law. I know in 1977 and in 1974, during my father's term, there were certain religious laws that were passed. And I think it was because he was facing a particular kind of political pressure, and he wanted to steal the ground from them, and so he did that. But in my time, there hasn't been a policy issue on which, they wanted us to declare some people minorities who are from Balochistan. We never did that. There were other things that we didn't. So I was lucky in the sense that we never needed to kowtow to them. My father's opposition was largely, violent opposition came largely from the religious parties. My opposition has also come from the religious parties, but in Karachi, and where the religious parties used to hold sway in my father's time, now there's an ethnic party. So we had greater problems with ethnicity. And then we had to keep making concessions on ethnic issues. Whereas for my father, Karachi was the stronghold of Jamaat-e-Islami. So he had compulsions of a different kind. Of course, the mosques opposed me. The religiously controlled mosques, not the government-controlled mosques, opposed me. And clerics inside Pakistan and within the Muslim world, the clerical institutions opposed me. But in terms of urban control, they didn't have urban control. In my father's time, they had urban control. Jamaat Islami was very strong even in Lahore. So now in Lahore we had Nawaz Sharif, and in Karachi we had M2M.
Just a comment here about the Islamic parties in Pakistan. They never really won a majority in any election at any point. I doubt if they ever got seats that were above 20% in the assembly in any election. And yet they were a big force. And I think you partly mentioned that in the other session that you had with the students, that the opposition organizes itself so much better in conditions where they probably feel that that's their only option of trying to get through a program that they want either instituted or passed. But I'd like to pull the discussion.
But if I can go back to that,
Okay.
the reason why it's important is not because they can win seats, but that our rival for power is not a political party, it's the military. And they have a lot of clout in the military. For instance, their magazines and publications like Takbir and Zindagi are read widely within the military. So they influence military thinking. And by influencing military thinking, they pose a danger to us. Because we've always looked, in the last decade, we've been overthrown twice with military-backed actions, and we've been denied 2 elections through military-backed actions. So for us, it is that the religious parties use the military, or the military uses the religious parties. I don't know which way it is. General Zia introduced the teaching of Maududi in the Pakistan Armed Forces, and the Pakistan Armed Forces are somehow taught to oppose liberalism, taught to oppose democracy. They taught the army officers on a whole have contempt for politicians. They have contempt for civilians. They say they're corrupt, although you can't find a civilian equivalent of a General Akhtar Abdur Rahman or a General Ziaul Haq who made all their fortunes on the Afghan war, or a General Fazl Haq who did it through the narcotics trade. But they have absolute contempt. And, they don't believe in social emancipation. Because I once went to the National Defense College and they said, well, what have you done? And don't tell us what you've done for women and what you've done for schools. But these are the issues in a civil society. It is women's rights. It is education. It is health. It is social issues. But they say, and don't tell us, it's sort of real contempt. For them, the real issues are jihad, are Islam. And what are you doing to promote the glory and the greatness of Pakistan? It's almost like a reverse of the Mughal Empire that once existed, that it will come to be. So, in that sense, one doesn't know what to do. I talked to my service chiefs. I said, why don't you start recruiting women? So, I was able to convince first the Navy chief said he'd do it. Then the next year, the Air Force chief said he'd do it. And my final year, the Army chief, Karamat, said he would start doing it. So, I hope that they start recruiting women, because I think women by their nature tend to be more progressive, to change the complexion. But it worries me when I see how dogmatic and inflexible they are. And I believe it's not so here, because I went to address off Washington Fort, I don't know the name of that military college. There is a military college just outside Washington, DC, and I went to address the colonels and so on. And I was so amazed to find that they had become us. Because when we were in college, we used to be against the Vietnam War and against intervention and so on. And now they were against intervention. And we were the ones who were saying, well, go, we've got to maintain the peace in Bosnia and we've got to go into Kosovo. So armies don't have to be dogmatic or rigid or wanting to fight for their own greater glory.
I had a question along those lines. I've just read the biography of your father by Stanley Wolfert. And one of the things that struck me was that your ancestors, your grandfather and so forth, had a good relationship with the generals, and your father, until the latter stages in 1977, invited them out to Larkana for boar hunts and such. When did this relationship go sour? And afterwards, was there something that you could have done to have reestablished a more harmonious relationship with the military?
It's, I would like to just say here that Stanley Wolfert's book is not an accurate description of my father's government. I met him. He wanted to research the book. I said, please come and do it. But once he came there, he sat with people like Mr. Kavasji, who was bitterly opposed to my father. And he came up with the fallacies that the opposition had. It wasn't a discovery of the man Bhutto or what he was, or to tell the people what were the influences in his life. It was the perspective seen from those who were his detractors, rather than what he meant to his supporters. Um, as I said to you earlier, it's like we have cordial relations. I have cordial relations with all my chiefs. We pray together. Break our fast during Ramzan together. We meet together. But in terms of power, there's a rivalry between the People's Party and the military to rule Pakistan. And in terms of ideology, there's a difference between the People's Party's perspective on peace with India or liberal values, which we think are universal but which they think are Western, and between their own ethos. So it's that clash. And you might have a liberal chief, but that liberal chief has to keep in mind the sentiments of his rank and file. So my grandfather didn't have a good relations. He had good relations with the British who were in power then. And afterwards, there's a perception that my father became a minister because my grandfather had good relations with Iskandar Mirza. And of course, the families knew each other, as lots of families know each other, but they weren't on such close terms that this would happen. In fact, my General Iskandar Mirza wanted a person from Sindh, and he happened to ask one of the civil servants who was a former was in the police, and that policeman my father happened to be his nephew. So he said, well, what about Zulfikar Ali Bhutto? He's just come from Oxford and California. So then Iskandar Mirza called my father. Of course, the families knew each other, but it was not because he knew my grandfather that he chose my father. And this always happens whenever there's a military dictatorship. They turn to the civil and military bureaucracy and say, give us names of well-educated people who we can choose from, and then they research that and they try to find. My father and I both worked for harmonious relations with the military. And in my second term, I gave them whatever they wanted. Even, on security issues, I built a consensus in both my terms. And whatever I did, I persuaded them. Sometimes I came in, but I built a consensus. So they were full partners in the security issue. Sometimes I did things that I thought ought to have been done differently. I give you an example. When the Soviets were going to withdraw from Afghanistan, Shevardnadze came to Pakistan, the Russian foreign minister, and he offered us a program where within 6 months Najib would leave and the Mujahideen would take over. I wanted to accept the program. I couldn't build a consensus, so I refused it, even though I thought it was in Pakistan's better interest to accept it, because I thought in security issues there ought to be a consensus. But I'm unable to answer. I found that the military generally really were good to me. When I went on the March 23rd parade in 1989, the troops and their wives mobbed my car. And General Beg got agitated. He was sitting, so what's happening? What's happening? And he was trying to call the security guards because he was not used to public displays of this nature. When I used to go for different functions, I used to find that the military are very good. What really went against me was something called the MISR reports. That's the Military Intelligence Services reports. And that is where the ISI, or the military intelligence, would say this government is corrupt and they're making money and we have to survive. There's inflation. Inflation is due to corruption. If it wasn't for Asim Zardari, if it wasn't for his horses, if it wasn't for the jam they ate, we won't have this kind of inflation. Or tax breaks have been announced if there wasn't corruption. So, they would send this first to the corps commanders and brainwash them. And after the corps commanders, they would have it read out to all the troops in all the cantonments. So what they would do was brainwash the entire army, which would start off accepting of us. And I sometimes say that those MISR reports, if you go over them and see which was accurate and which was inaccurate, then perhaps things would be different. I remember once one of the military reports said that the Prime Minister has agreed to what is it, mortgage or whatever, give a soft as mortgage to mortgage Pakistan's airports, shipping ports, and I forget the third thing, three things, airports, shipping ports, and one other port. These three things she's going to mortgage because her husband wants to do this contract with such and such friend of his. And I was shocked, and I called him and I said, General, you know that our government has done away with sovereign guarantees? Do you know that other governments did sovereign guarantees and we've done away, and you're saying we're giving these as sovereign guarantees? I said, hold accountability. How could people do a verifiable fact? If something was not verifiable, it's a different thing, but this is a government policy, no more sovereign guarantees. But it's that kind, and then the officers read it and they say, oh, they're going to sell our airports. Or they'd say they're spies of Israel, or they'd say they're pro-India. So they create venom and hatred and poison everybody down the line. How it happens at the top level, I don't know. I don't know whether it's like people like Nawaz Sharif and all have a close association with them and feed them, or whether it's done another way. But it is that kind of, tussle for power and using mudslinging as a way to get the political parties out.
That brings right into my question about corruption. Leaderships in various third world countries have often been accused of corruption, and we know that sometimes the problem is more complex than that. But theorists have always said that the leadership has a lot to do in terms of creating an atmosphere conducive to that kind of culture of corruption, or not so. Last night you mentioned that one of the biggest problems that you thought you had in your administration was not investigating enough in terms of corruption. I was wondering, Ms. Bhutto, if you could elaborate on that. What kind of investigations do you think you could have done to make things different than what they eventually became?
But I just want to clarify here that I think that dictators do corruption, not Democrats. Because in dictatorship, the police are scared, the judges are scared, everybody is scared. In democracy, nobody is scared. And all the papers are there out in open. And I would like to welcome somebody from your college to come to Pakistan who's doing law and go through all those papers and give you a report whether there is an iota of corruption. I've heard so much about this corruption, I'd like to see where it was. Somebody should give me proof. Okay, if I say I'm not corrupt, my husband says he's not corrupt, if there was so much corruption happening, can somebody tell me which minister was corrupt and what case has come up for corruption? It's become a situation where they built up this corruption thing where you have to sit around and say yes, because if you don't, people won't believe you. But since we're talking here frankly, and this is for the archives, I'd like to tell you, where is this corruption? I've heard for 10 years nothing but that the People's Party government was corrupt. When? Forget corruption means, that it's taking place on an endemic level. Give me one case. I'm happy with one case of corruption. Show me one case where this was done. But here is a government that lived by the rules, that governed by the rules, and whose opponents could never find a single case of corruption. And yet the whole world is willing to accept that one man, the president, in a military-backed action, goes and says the government is corrupt, so we become corrupt. How do we become corrupt? Because one man says an action. What I said last night was that we were unable to deal with the perceptions of corruption. Because for me, they were perceptions. If you look at the economic performances, corrupt economies do not prosper. Corrupt economies are not successful. Our economic performance was the best of any government since 1977. And I was in the IMF last month, and one of the vice presidents of the IMF said that at that particular period of time, we had one of the highest growth rates compared to all the developing countries of the world. So somewhere along the line, in academic circles at least, somebody has to analyze and not just accept what people say. When I was Prime Minister, people were making money. But making money is legitimate business. People were making money. I would have 10 different, I'd have a situation where there'd be 10 different companies competing for a contract. And I'd have people who were presidents of foreign countries. I'd have people who were their cabinet ministers ring me up and try to influence me in the award of that contract. And I had them write letters to me seeking to influence me. I'm talking about foreign prime ministers and presidents and their cabinet members because they all wanted the contracts. And I was not influenced. I said there'll be a tendering process, and if somebody has a complaint, let them go. Once I was rung up by a very powerful country, and because I said, all right, re-tender. But I did not exercise the power that I had as Prime Minister to say that I think it's in our interest to give this contract to A, B, or C. And that's why I feel so deeply offended. Because there was such severe competition for contracts, the losing party would be prone to hear, yes, it was corruption. You see, now there are no contracts. Now it's governmental corruption. At that time, there were, and my husband, yes, he helped not to enrich himself, he helped to enrich Pakistan. And Pakistan got enriched. We did triple our growth rate. We did double our national revenues. We did get 20 times more foreign investment than direct foreign investment, 20 times more than there had been in any previous government. All that happened. How could it happen if it was a corrupt economy? Because in a corrupt economy, one person decides. If I have to decide or my husband has to decide the contract, how many can you decide in a day? But if you can just go to the different departments, you've got contracts pouring in. And we had contracts pouring into Pakistan. You know the American ambassador, Tom Simons. He was one of the people who went on saying we were corrupt. So what are you supposed to do as Prime Minister when a particular person doesn't like you? He didn't like me. In my first term, the English diplomat, Sir Nicholas Barrington, didn't like me. He had been a junior officer, as had Tom Simons, when my father was the foreign minister. They didn't like my father because he was perceived as a communist, because he was pro-Chinese. They walked in with preconceptions and prejudices against me, and they came in. Now, I'll tell you a story. At least Nicholas never asked me to give a contract. Tom Simons walks in, and there was, in Afghanistan, there was a contract. I never interfered in any contract, you see, because I thought that tomorrow my military will make a case on me. So I never ever interfere. Whether it was good or bad, I said let it go its way, as long as it's legal. If there's something that's illegal in it, I'll interfere, not otherwise. There was a contract that was, the Saudis had come in 1994, and they wanted to build an oil pipeline from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan to Pakistan. I sent them to my ministers, and my ministers thought the Saudis were being foolish because there was war in Afghanistan and the pipeline would never get built. So they went ahead and they said, they gave them the pipeline. They said, actually, we're going to build a pipeline with Iran, and or we're going to get gas from Qatar. But if we have briders from Saudi Arabia and Argentina, if we put pressure on the others, they'll think there's an alternative, we'll get a better negotiating price. So they gave it to briders. After they gave to briders spent money, and peace was restored in the southern part of Afghanistan, and the project became a viability. The moment the project became a viability, Unical wanted it. And whose arm would they twist to break the briders contract? Mine. If I had broken the briders contract, people would have thought I had an interest in Unical. Who comes to see me? The ambassador of America. Break the contract. I said, how can I break the contract, ambassador? He said, yes, you can. I said, no, ambassador, I can't. And he said, it's a very important interest. I said, why don't you do a joint enterprise? And you know what he tells me? He tried to imply that I was corrupt by not giving it to them. He was being corrupt, and he tried to imply that I was corrupt. And I got so angry at his arrogant manner and coming in and asking me to break the law and to do something wrong and acting holier than mighty, that I said to him, I said, excuse me, ambassador, that's it, fine. But later on, he apologized to me. But the fact is that he blackened my government's name. He spoiled our records here. There was another time when my intelligence gave me a letter he'd written on wheat. The Ministry of Agriculture had imported wheat. And they had imported the wheat from Australia, not from America. The American ambassador had written a report to his government saying that, you know, the wheat contract has not been given to us. The wheat contract has been given to an Australian firm. And I don't like to repeat this, but it said that Asif Zardari, the spouse of the Prime Minister, has an interest in this deal. I'm so horrified. I don't know who told him this, you know, to give him the benefit of doubt. Maybe my eyesight told him, maybe Nawaz Sharif told him. I called the Ministry of Agriculture. And I said, what is this? What have you gone and done in the wheat? Because the wheat has nothing to do with me or my husband. So what have you gone and done in the wheat? Why didn't you buy American wheat? So he said, the reason we didn't buy American wheat is that the Americans give us credit, but they charge us significantly more for the wheat. It's expensive wheat. And he said, when we have the money, why should we waste our country's resources? Why should we get into debt Why should we take this credit? Why should we pay more? Why should we pay interest on what we paid more? We should buy from Australia, which is much cheaper, and giving us when we've got the money. And I said, you're right. But it's all trade wars. And when I'm Prime Minister of Pakistan, Pakistan's ripe, the opportunities are ripe for the picking. And in the trade wars, somehow or the other, we're the ones who get the bad name, although we're not benefiting ourselves. So on that sort of sense, I feel very strongly about this corruption issue, because our entire government was a democratic government. It was not Marcos who could decide who to give a contract to or not. I had presidents of Muslim countries and presidents of Western countries asking me to give contracts, and I didn't interfere. And this is the reward that I get for this sort of thing. So I really would urge you that if you have a law student here, I would be prepared to look after all the expenses in Pakistan, to go over the material and see whether there's even one prima facie case. In my last government, they went and hired a man from England called Bukhari, and he said, I'm a British citizen, and I've been kidnapped by Asif Zardari, and he wanted money from me, and he tied a bomb on my leg. And the Washington Post wrote a whole, from top to bottom spread with a huge glamorous picture of my husband and myself. And they wrote that her husband was killed. I was so upset. I remember how mentally disturbed I was to say that a reputable paper like the Washington Post could go out and do this. And at the end of the day, it was when the case came to court, it was proved that the man had been hired. He had been bribed through his wife with a valuable urban property valued at $250,000 to make that statement. He was a twice convicted con man who had been sentenced in England for setting fire to poor people's homes to force them out of their properties and grab their properties. Did the Washington Times write all that?
Did the
Washington Post, not the Times.
Did
Washington,
they ever retract their
No,
story?
they never did. Even though the court decided and the full facts about this man came back, did the Washington Post do it? No. The New York Times wrote another very damaging story against me. I have given Waqas opinion by the British lawyers, which takes apart each of those documents that the New York Times has published. The Financial Times published a story of corruption, the same thing, 129 times against us. 129 times. What was the need for the repetition? The same facts. What was printed in the New York Times, those same papers were printed across England, and they said independent investigation. No, they were the same papers. They came up with a friend of my sister called Farida Ataullah, and they said that she is my personal secretary, Farida Hidayatullah. I don't know whether you know the Hidayatullahs of Karachi. Farida had been my secretary way back before I was Prime Minister in my first term. I mean, they did such things that could have been verified. They weren't interested. Even when I gave the interviews, they simply were. They had made up their minds. They had prejudged. And I wonder why. And I think because I'm young, we are a glamorous couple, we sell news. And people don't want to hear about saints. They want to hear about sinners. So all this is very good material. Pakistanis, Iranians, all, Asians, Indians, they're all interested. So I have really had a tough time because it's so very easy to build up people and bring them down. But at the bottom of the day, fair and honest people have to scrutinize it. Now, I do think we failed in having an independent machinery. Instead of saying, well, these are trumped-up charges that my opposition is making, I should have done something about it. So I regret that. I think that if there had been something done in a way that had satisfied the opposition, then, so they wouldn't have been able to harm us much more subsequently. So I think that was a major error on our part, not to have that independent investigative machine.
The fact today is that the Pakistani economy is in a mess. To make a statement that is perhaps even as such an understatement. And we as a people, and pardon again my generalization here, are proverbially reluctant to invest money in private institutions of research, for education, for purposes that would institutionalize some kind of progressive development activity. We do invest money, or Pakistanis do invest money, in religious institutions, but they seem not to be interested in promoting and encouraging scientific and technological research or education at a widespread level. What ideas did you have regarding this in order to make this a more conducive atmosphere or perhaps create an awareness amongst the people. You ought to be doing this. Did your government do anything in this regard? Are you planning something about this?
Well, what we did do was increase the education expenditure, and we did try to make the universities have more money for their own services by putting in that 25% of full fee-paying students. We also permitted private sector universities, and the first large number, before that there had been exceptions given, but the first large number of private sector universities that came in during the Pakistan People's Party government. So we did try, but we had so many other focuses that perhaps we didn't do it in as much a sustained way, but we started the change. And I think the private sector universities today have more money, and for those who can afford it, are able to uh, offer education at a much higher level. That's not very good for the other schools. But I think that at least if there's a part of the society that is catered for, maybe it will make it easier for government to cater to the rest of the universities. In our country, somehow we don't have very much of a research atmosphere. Um, I'm associated with the private sector university. It's a non-profit. It's Abbas. And they've opened their own research centers. So maybe as we have private colleges, people will begin their own research centers and we'll see more money going into it. As far as government is concerned, government hardly has any money. The money, it doesn't have money to make its hospitals run or its colleges run. And research needs money. You need to have people who can do it as a full-time occupation. And unless we find some way to cut our costs and increase our economy, it's going to be very difficult. You know, the Pakistan's total income when I left office, I mean, with Pakistan's income when I took office, was 150 million rupees. Billion rupees, 150 billion rupees. And we doubled that to 300, almost 300 billion rupees in 3 years. It was meant to go up to 900 billion the year that we were thrown out. But anyhow, after my dismissal, Nawaz Sharif, for his first 2 years, was not even able to get, not 1 year have they matched ours. Once they came close to matching such an old one. But in 3 years, you can double it from 150 to 300 billion. 4 years have passed, and they're not able to collect the same amount of money that we collected. Only in 1 year, Nawaz was able to collect 2 billion less than we collected. But otherwise, they don't even come near it. Even Musharraf cannot come near collecting 300 billion rupees. At the time that we were collecting 300 billion rupees, we were paying 116 billion for the army. And we were paying 136 billion for debt. And we were paying the rest and borrowing some for development. Since our government has gone and the rupee has been devalued, now our debt is 300 billion. So we are borrowing for defense and we are borrowing for civil. So you can see the cost in economic terms to the people of Pakistan by sacking the People's Party government. And I often say, you want to talk about accountability? What about these stark facts of what was the size of the economy then and what is the size of the economy now? And the only reason the economy was turned around was because we looked after business people, not for our own selfish interests, but because we knew that to turn the economy around, you need the business community.
Does this kind of circumstances make any sense at all to accept the intervention of IMF and World Bank in terms of conditionalities? Because obviously the country is at the point of default or defaulting its.
We have defaulted. They've rescheduled our debts. The only reason we have money is because we've rescheduled our debts. If we had to pay that 300 billion, we'd have nothing for defense or social. They've rescheduled it. So under Nawaz, they said you don't have to pay the debt for I don't know how many years, right? So we had 300 billion. But if we had to give that 300 to them, we wouldn't have that 300 billion rupees. And that's how they're surviving now. And it's a nightmare situation. It's really an economic basket case. And it surprises me that people are not more worried. I feel worried when I look upon it. But the IMF, now if the IMF didn't reschedule it, we'd have to give them that 300 billion. How would we live? If we tell the IMF to go to hell, no foreign bank will give us credit. We won't have money to import petrol, and we won't have money to import wheat. So it's very easy to tell the IMF to go off to hell. But our public are not prepared to make that sacrifice. If our public said, okay, we're only going to eat rice because we produce lots of rice and we export it, and we don't want wheat, that wouldn't be a problem. We spend about $1 billion or $1.2 billion a year importing wheat. So we'd have a huge amount. We spend huge amounts on nearly $1 billion on importing petrol. We produce some and we import the rest. But they're not prepared to do that. So we can't tell the IMF, but I never signed an IMF agreement. Both the agreements that were signed by Ghulam Isaac and Moin Qureshi, and I lived with the terms. But in those two agreements, when after 3 years, from 93 to 96, the IMF agreement was expiring. The IMF wanted us to sign ESAP, which had more stringent conditionalities, and they were prepared to give more money. But I was not prepared to take more money, because I thought it's better to have slower growth, but try to get yourself out of a trap in which you are, and we wanted SBA. And one of the ways that Farooq Laghari and Nawaz Sharif were able to get the financial institutions behind them was to say that they would have ESAP. The second thing was that Candace, who the MD, was very keen on tariffs rationalization. And I also believe that tariffs should be lowered. But when you lower tariffs, you lose revenue. And when you lower you lose customs income. And they say, you'll make it up through GST, but you never make it out. So that's just on paper you make it up. You lose revenues. The second thing is if I have to pay $1 for foreign lipstick, I'd rather buy the foreign lipstick than pay 90p or 90 cents for a Pakistani lipstick. So imports become cheaper. So people import more. And that puts a strain on your foreign currency. So that's why I didn't want to do the ESAP and a quicker lowering of tariffs. We had to lower tariffs by, I forget now, under the WTO 2005 or 2006 or whenever it was. But I didn't want to do a rush because I felt that the strength of our economy had still to be built up before we could do it. And one of the greatest disservices that Laghari and Nawaz did were to get power, to get international sanction by saying she doesn't want ESAP, we will do ESAP. Well, they tied their own hands. I mean, they did it, but their foreign currency deposits went on getting depleted, and the economy couldn't sustain it. And of course, I believe that tariffs should be lowered. I believe our people should have right to cheaper goods. But if we had a time lag, I wanted to make use of that time lag so that our economy could absorb the structural changes, the shocks of the structural changes.
I sense that our time is about over, and I did want to ask you about this in the New York Times, but I feel as though I might be ambushing you on this, so I'll go to one last question.
On the New York Times, please ask me what you want to. I'll be quite happy to answer it.
I was quite surprised this morning as I was eating breakfast to open the paper and to see this article on the op-ed page, as the conflict intensifies, it's India's move. And then here, what I
haven't seen them. I'm going to have to borrow it.
Well, that's why I feel as though I'm ambushing you. That and this has to do with perception, how to overcome the perception. Well, I need to read it first. How to overcome the perception that people have. First of all, these two men make unkind remarks about Mr. Nawaz Sharif, and but then following that, they say his predecessor, Benazir Bhutto, effectively gutted public education, clearing the way for the growth of madrasas, some of which are breeding grounds for soldiers of holy war. And I had thought that you had promoted education. You said that last night. You said that today.
Yes.
But how do American people know to separate lies from truth?
Well, go to the World Bank and get the figures, because the World Bank will show you that we increased education expenditure from about 2% of GDP or GNP to 2.51% of GNP. And then our government went, the GNP ratio was cut down again.
Sitting at breakfast reading this doesn't have that
I
kind
mean,
of
I don't know
access.
how they could write this. I really, really don't know how. This is what I don't understand. That why don't these people go to the World Bank? If they think we Pakistanis are liars, they should go to the World Bank and see what we did. I mean, that Vice President of World Bank, Miko, she wrote me a letter when we were building these primaries, we raised the literacy rate by 1/3. And we wanted schools to prevent our children going to factories to work and to do child labor, and we wanted schools to prevent them to be taken up by the madrasas. And we wanted them to, of course, have education. And we built 48,000 schools, which in 3 years, previous governments couldn't even decide which area to make for more than 100 schools. But because we had all the people with us, we tell the communities do decide. The criteria is that wherever there's a population of 5 to 8,000 and you don't have a school, you can make it. Now, if you've got 100 such areas and you are getting 5 schools, decide which 5 you want to do it. And it would just go so fast. So it's 48,000 schools.
Perception. How do you
I don't
overcome
know.
this?
I just think that I just don't know. Maybe it's the universities. Maybe we need some people to come out and research it. Because I just don't know what to do with people who go on writing things in the face of facts. If it was between Nawaz and me, I'd say they don't know. But if the World Bank has got the figures that our education was increased from approximately 2% of GNP to 2.51%, which released billions of extra rupees. If they've got that the literacy rate went up from 26% to 35%, I don't know how they can do this. I just don't, and I think it's such a gross injustice to the American public and to the Pakistani public. I remember Miko, the vice president of the World Bank, writing to me that they wanted to see whether we are really building schools or they're just on paper. So she toured and she wrote to me, she said, I had tears in my eyes when I visited these schools and saw the hope in the eyes of the people that their lives would change. And literally schools, I feel, I used to inspect some of the schools myself. And just to make the bureaucracy know that either I or one of the ministers will pop up one day. And I remember when I went to one in Lahore, from nowhere the parents came and I was mobbed. And there were women weeping and saying we didn't want our children growing up like ourselves and now they have a chance. So this is the one area which can really change people's outlooks and their lives and give them hope and the ability to sustain art. So I don't know what to do with perception because I've got a problem with the corruption perception. People went around saying that I was a fundamentalist. They said because she wears a dupatta on her head and because she has a tasbih, it's like a rosary. She's a fundamentalist. I used to have a tasbih because I hear public life, you have to hear a lot of nonsense and be quiet. So I found it meditative in my life, to be listening politely to what people had to say and not to get angry or riled up because sometimes we hear really ridiculous stuff, but you have to be calm. So thank you for giving this to me. Could I keep it or would I be really ambitious? Thank you. I would like to have this responded to. He's an Institute of Peace in Washington.
This is like close to saying that the party supports fundamentalism. It's very interesting, but it's completely at odds with the party manifesto itself. So it's
And the madrasas were not me. How can you say gutted public education? I mean, it's just so unfair.
I look forward to seeing a letter from you to the editor.
Yes.
There's one last question here.
Ms. Bhutto, I have one last question. Your supporters and opponents alike agree on one thing, and that is your sense of mission to Pakistan. It's very interesting. No matter where they stand, they agree on that you have that sense of mission to Pakistan. My question is this: if there comes a time that you are not leading the PPP and therefore will not be prime minister or even decide to retire from politics, how do you see yourself continuing that sense of mission? Which other ways besides politics do you see yourself serving Pakistan and bringing to reality some of the dreams that your father had and some of those that you also have?
Well, it's a very good question you asked me because obviously I don't want to do politics all the time and I would like to see a transition of power within Pakistan, within my own party and within the government. And I'd also like to be, if not prime minister, and not be hounded. With me, it's like for the last 23 years, either being hounded or I've been prime minister. And I want a time of less anxiety, worrying, stress. Um, I don't know what I do. You know, I think about it at times, but I know I'd work because I'm so used to being busy that I'd lose my own identity if I didn't keep myself busy. I would probably like to take a little bit of time uh, for myself, but I know that if I had too much of that, I just go get bored. So I don't know what I would do. You know, I think about it and I wonder whether I'd spend more time in my constituency, whether I'd spend more time outside. I'm interested in education. I'm interested in peace. I'm interested in women's uh, issues, and I would like to do something, but I'm not exactly clear what that would be. But I'm also one of those people who thinks that you should, flow with nature and see what happens. You don't have to have all the answers today. It's important to focus on what are the more important questions to which you need the answers, and then let the answers to the other questions come back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Really
so much.